Today, what I'm going to do is give you a short lecture on imperialism in the region of Southeast Asia. Just a reminder that there are no notes required, but I am going to ask you to consider a couple things as you are listening. The two main questions that you're going to be looking for as you listen to this lecture are first, why did European countries and the United States want control over or to exert influence over regions of Southeast Asia? What were their motives? So you're going to remember the motives of imperialism, see which ones show up here. And number two, what were the negative consequences of imperialism in Southeast Asia for the people that were living within those countries or the native peoples? Let's get started. So imperialism in Southeast Asia, if you don't know where Southeast Asia is, I wanted to give you a map of the world with this particular region highlighted in an orange or red on the right-hand side of the screen. What we see is that throughout the 18 and 1900s, a series of European powers, as well as the United States, invade and take control over what is known as the Pacific Rim, the lands and territories and countries around the Pacific Ocean. A couple of the motives that they were most interested in happen to be because this particular global location was a great spot for trade with Asia, as well as a good location for military posts to secure kind of a worldwide military control or at least worldwide military access. I remember during this time, the refueling stations, right? So if you wanted to create a military outpost, it became a place where you could extend military influence into beyond your country's borders. Secondarily, there was land and natural resources. This area was ripe for plantation agriculture. And so a lot of cash crops and export crops such as sugarcane, coffee, bananas, cocoa, rubber, coconuts, pineapple, I put rubber in there twice, and tin were abundantly available in this region of the world. And lastly, for religious motives as well, right? The presence of Christian missionaries wanting to evangelize to these new territories. This is a quick map. You don't have to memorize anything from it, but a quick map of areas that were under control from 1870 to 1914. And each of the different colors indicates a different country, such as the Dutch or the French or the Portuguese, German, and the US, that gained control of these respective areas. First, we're going to start talking about the Dutch East India Company, which really survives and exists from about the early 1600s to the late 1700s. The Dutch East India Company was a literal company. It was an institution, organization, an economic entity that sought to control the Indonesian islands. It was renamed at one point, these islands, as the Dutch East Indies. And the main reason that they were interested in it had to do with plantation crops, again, mentioned before, as well as oil and rubber, which were natural resources found in abundance in these areas. Some Dutch people moved and ended up living within the Indonesian islands, and there they created a social class system where they, no surprises here, remained at the top, where there was wealthy and educated native Indonesians and kind of the middle class, and where folks that worked on the plantations as laborers were the very bottom rungs of society. So a very strict class-based system that operated for several decades. Unfortunately for the native Indonesian farmers and laborers, most of the crops they planted were taken by the Dutch East India Company and sold as exports to other countries. And again, this is going to cause a lack of food supply for native Indonesians, as well as they don't make the profits, right? They do the labor, but they were not gaining profits. It was the Dutch East India Company that was making all of the money. Competing alongside the Dutch is the country of Great Britain. Again, with a huge naval empire, they wanted to establish some trade ports as well as military ports throughout Southeast Asia. They're also interested in natural resources like tin and rubber in Singapore. And eventually, Great Britain is going to be able to conquer Burma, which is modern-day Myanmar, and make it a province of British-controlled India. If you take a look at the map, British-controlled India is going to be directly west of this. So what's going to be bridging the British Empire in this area is both India as a subcontinent as well as Burma. Eventually, the British will increase their territorial control to include Penang, Singapore, and Malacca as well, with those respective dates listed below. And the French were not to be left out either. So the French are going to arrive in Southeast Asia in the 1600s, primarily for trade purposes. They're going to take over the city of Saigon in 1859, and they are going to really ramp up their control and their conquest of what is considered to be Indochina, modern-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia by the year 1907. You want to take a look at the map on the right-hand side. It's that kind of light orange colored territories. The French, differently than the British and the Dutch, are going to institute something known as direct rule or direct control in Indochina, meaning that they're actually going to import and bring over from France French officials to oversee and administer local government happenings and oversee trade and domestic agreements within those three different countries. They're going to try to exert complete control over all domestic industries within Indochina. And unfortunately, they're going to ship so much rice out of the country as export sales. There'll be, again, a repeated pattern of lack of food, right, for the native peoples, the people that are actually doing the labor, or oftentimes facing starvation and famine as well. The French were also very heavily controlling, and they actually did not allow industrialization to take place in any form in Indochina during the rule or during their control. Spain, again, not to be left out, is going to make an early headway into the Philippines, also located in Southeast Asia. In the year 1565, Spain controls the Philippines until they are defeated by the United States in the Spanish-American War in 1898. So they have control of the country for roughly 300 years. You see a huge impact of that on the language and the culture of the Philippines. Catholicism as well as Spanish are very widely used language and religion in that region of the world. The United States in 1898 are going to help the Filipino people fight against Spanish rule and eventually win their independence. The United States begins on the side of the Filipino people. They win a successful victory, and then unfortunately the United States changes their mind and goes back on their word. They then go in to try to take control over the Philippines themselves. This is us, the United States. And they do that primarily because of economic interests, the desire for natural resources, a sense of paternalism that the Filipino people are unable to rule themselves, and a general fear that if the United States didn't claim this territory, another country would come in and do just that. The Philippine-American War is fought from 1899 to 1902. It results in a U.S. victory and an eventual U.S. occupation. The United States will claim the Philippines through the 1900s all the way to the end of World War II. This brings us to our very last slide. The country of Thailand, if you've taken a look at all the maps that we've seen, is the only Southeast Asian country or state to be able to remain independent during the colonial period. You'll see that they're unmarked by other colonial influence. And how are they able to do this? If you take a look at the picture on the right-hand side, there's a man named King Mongkut, who was the king of Thailand during this time. What he does is that as he takes control of Thailand, he initiates, kind of similarly to Japan during their era of industrialization, the modernization of the education government systems. He does learn English. He teaches some of his top government leaders to negotiate in English as well. He tries to open Thailand's doors to a certain degree to Western influences, aspects of culture, language, and customs. And what he's going to do is negotiate with a couple different European powers and essentially say that Thailand should remain neutral because on one side of Thailand, there is British-controlled Burma to the west, and to the eastern side, there is French-controlled Indochina. And he basically makes the argument that if one of them were to take over Thailand, that would put them in too close proximity to one of their competitors, and that would inevitably get them embroiled in conflict, war, or otherwise. So they allow Thailand to remain as kind of a neutral zone in between the French and the British-controlled areas. And Thailand is able to successfully stay independent from foreign influence. That brings us to the end of our lecture. I just want to remind you again that the two things you were looking for in this that you can refresh your memory on right now is one, what were some of the motives that you saw show up in why countries exerted influence in Southeast Asia? And two, what were ways in which the native peoples were harmed by imperialism and by foreign influence throughout this era?